Okay. Here's a headline from the Washington Post just this past month. Doar driver saves life while delivering a pizza. When Sophia Furtado approached her delivery location, she expected to simply deliver a pizza. Instead, she delivered a second chance at life. That's because Furtado's customer, Karen Herbert, was sprawled on the driveway in front of her home, showing extensive bleeding from a head wound. That's when Furtado bolted into action, running into the house, screaming for help. The commotion quickly woke up Karen's husband, Robert, who immediately came downstairs and called 911. Furtado said, "It happened so fast I was freaking out because I didn't know how much longer she had." Having been previously trained as an EMT, Furtado calmly relayed the important details to 911 dispatcher and instructed Robert to retrieve gauze and a towel to stop the bleeding. Law enforcement personnel who responded to the scene lauded Furtado's quick thinking and action. Police officer Jillian Joden said, "What Sophia did that night is not something that anyone would just do. We've seen people walk away, run away, drive away, pull out their phones and start filming, or simply just, stand there and watch. When Sophia sprang into action, she saved a life." So, great story, right? I mean, we love this kind of stuff because Furtado, she's a hero. She, I'm sure, was lauded in her local community. And I'm guessing you can all think of other stories that you've heard about people who go the extra mile to give assistance rather than turning on your backs on someone who's in the middle of a crisis. And you know what? In our culture, what do we call these folks? Angels, yeah, or Good Samaritans. Angels, Good Samaritans. I mean, we even have this thing called a Good Samaritan law that protects people who act in these kinds of situations. They're the people who step in to help or rescue without hesitation because they've seen the need. And these angels or Good Samaritans, they stand out because most people, they might call 911, but otherwise they're kind of worried about getting involved. The Good Samaritans, they're the exceptional ones. But I'm wondering, what do you think? Is it just that we all really need a bit of inspiration? A bit of reminding that, you can do this too. And then we would be fired up to go forth and do likewise. Kind of like Jesus says. What do you think? I don't see any of you jumping on it. See, that would make my job too easy. We would be like, we got this parable down, and we can just move forward with the service, get you all out for your lunches faster. But here's the clue. This is a parable. And parables, as we know from reading them across all the Gospels, are so much more than just motivational anecdotes. They're puzzles, they're little conundrums used by Jesus to turn around our fundamental thinking and perceptions about our relationship with God and our relationships with each other. Now, I'm guessing that if we stopped at that headlines level idea of what this parable holds for us, well, that would be part of it, but we might be missing a lot of what Jesus is really up to here. So, let me ask you all a question. Which of the characters in this story do you identify with? Anyone willing to share?
We would like to think it would be the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
We like to think it would be the Good Samaritan. How many of you, that's the one you really want to be? A lot of us, right? Yeah. Why? Because we want to be the ones who are willing to step in and help and be like Furtado was in that story. Anyone else? Different person they identify with the story?
The innkeeper.
The innkeeper. Oh, say more about that.
A part of the infrastructure of society, it will help other people, travelers.
So you're there, you're able to be in a position to help.
Yes, it's scary to be the person on the scene, but I'd like to be the person behind the scene.
You're not the only person that said, somebody said that at 8 o'clock too. Same reason. Feels a little bit safer. You want to help, but you want someone to have your back, kind of. Anyone else? Any other characters in the story?
This week, the guy lying on the side of the road.
The guy lying on the side of the road.
Yeah.
Yep. A lot of us feel that way. Like we're the ones that have been run over. Anybody priest or Levite?
Yeah, but how many of us actually are the priest or the Levite?
That's a good question.
There you go.
None of us wants to say that we might be the priest or Levite, but you know what? If I think about it, there's situations where I'd be like too scared to get involved. Now, anyone going for the robbers? Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Oh, come on.
The point is that we all have a different entry into this parable. And you know what? We're kind of split. We're all sort of, all over the map. I was reading Jewish New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine, and she suggests that the majority of Jesus' audience would have been unlikely to identify with anyone but that traveler. Why? Well, mostly because of who they were and who the Samaritan was and the relationship between them. See, there's a couple of them in Jesus' audience that could have been descendants of Aaron and Levi and would have to sort of stop and have that thinking through that we all had, which is like, would I actually be too scared to help this injured man? Because you know what? Those robbers, they could be still laying in wait for the person who comes along to help, right? That's a reasonable reaction. But most of Jesus' audience, including the lawyer who asked Jesus the question, who is my neighbor? They're not priests or Levites. They're mostly like us. They're unlikely to see themselves as the highwaymen who are preying on defensive travelers. But unlike us, they would probably never in a million years identify as that Samaritan either. And you know what, even in the unlikely event that there was a Samaritan or two in the audience, which who knows, Jesus was in Samaria a couple chapters before this, they too would have found it hard to see themselves as the Samaritan the way he's presented in this story. What they have that none of us do is a generations-old mutual antagonism between Judea and Samaria, between Jews and Samaritans. In fact, they did not get along at all. Samaria is the territory that was once the northern kingdom of Israel. They are originally from the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, just like the people who are gathered around Jesus. But you know what? If you read through the Old Testament, you can hear about how they have drifted so far apart over time. Because each of them start to insist that they had within their own borders the primary shrine where one had to go to worship God, as well as the correct understanding of how to interpret the law. Sound a little familiar? I was kind of thinking about European history as I was reading this. And this obviously also means that their king should hold primacy too. You can start to see the problems playing out. And then things fell apart even further because the northern kingdom spent twice as long under the thumb of the Babylonians as the south. Their people were scattered further for longer, and by the time everybody came back after the Babylonian Empire was vanquished, at the end of this devastating period for both people, well, they really did have very different understandings of what had happened and why, and how their relationship with God fit in to all of this. Now, this conflict between them, well, it continued to simmer, and it periodically boiled over into, wars. And despite this original shared heritage, well, these two peoples never really saw eye to eye again. And by Jesus' day, they had long considered each other that enemy that's right there on our doorstep. In fact, both Samaritans and Jews would see the other as the last person that they would ever consider accepting help from. In other words, when Jesus uses this parable to answer the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus is saying even your worst enemy is your neighbor. Not only are your worst enemies the very people to whom you owe rescue and care and compassion, but you need to start thinking of them as someone from whom you might accept help when you are at your most desperate and your most vulnerable. Now, I'm guessing that not a single person in that audience heard this as a feel-good inspirational anecdote. I think that it wasn't just that lawyer who felt a kind of begrudging sense of discomfort. I mean, you can hear it in the way he responds to Jesus. He doesn't even utter the word Samaritan when he has to admit that that was in fact the one who had acted as a neighbor to the man who was left for dead on the road. I can almost hear that audible gasp in the crowd when all of them started to pick up on the full ramifications of what Jesus was asking of them through the telling of this parable. I mean, it's one thing to hear Jesus say, love your enemies, in the context of this mountainside sermon full of all kinds of high ideas about blessings and woes. But you know what? It's quite another to hear this kind of very specific example of how far one's meant to go. And to have to listen to the example of righteousness that's being held up, being someone who's a member of your most despised group of enemies. I mean, you can hear all the murmuring starting up in the crowd. I didn't realize that you meant even those people over there, Jesus. I mean, they are not godly. Are they even capable of this kind of mercy? But Jesus is clear. Do this, and you will live. He's kind of transformed the terms of the whole conversation. Because, that lawyer, he wanted to know what he should do to secure eternal life. And Jesus' answer is about ensuring life rather than never-ending violence and unnecessary death in the here and now first. Now, Amy Jo Levine points out to a clever little wordplay that Jesus has going on here too. Because apparently the word for neighbor and the word for evil in Hebrew look exactly the same when they're written down. That's because when they wrote Hebrew, they skipped all the vowels because it saved space. They just wrote the consonants and they could figure it out from context. So when Jesus asked that lawyer, how do you read the law? Not what do you know about the law, what do you remember that the law says, but how do you read? It's like Jesus is saying to him, you have a choice. I mean, you choose to yell out one vowel like, ugh, and you are calling them evil. But you know what? If you choose to breathe out another one like, ah, they could, in fact, be your neighbor. So, what would this look like today? If we could begin to call our enemies neighbors. If we could begin to show them the kind of mercy and care that God is commanding us to show to all our neighbors. Well, for starters, the Middle East might be a very different place today because that West Bank is pretty much what was once Samaria, and you know what? There is still very little neighborliness happening between there and Jerusalem to this day. But you know what? I think that we all need to hear this incredibly challenging good news from Jesus the whole world over. Because humanity, we're really not that different from that crowd of Judeans that was gathered around Jesus. I mean, we too are more comfortable speaking with a kind of vitriol or wreaking violence upon our enemies than we are going out and binding up their wounds or letting them bind up ours. I mean, just this past year alone, we've watched generations-old conflicts reignite once again with devastating consequences for the people of Afghanistan, Ukraine, and even all those young Russians who have been sent off to a war that they don't have a choice about. And you know what? We see it in our own backyard also. That inability to treat our enemies as our neighbors, it just keeps boiling over in division, antipathy, rage, and violence. But Jesus is clear. Living as enemies, well, that's a recipe for death after death after death. It's the kind of cycle that really can only be ended through a complete transformation of both attitude and action. Love God. Love our neighbor. Even our neighbors that we think of as enemies. That's the secret to life here and now and life eternal. So, who's my neighbor? I think the only way that we can truly answer this question is to start by asking ourselves, who is my enemy? Now that's the kind of spiritual work, well, it might take some unflinching honesty with ourselves. We might not even be able to utter their names. But you know what? Maybe if we start to ask those questions for ourselves, maybe then we can begin to imagine what it might look like to choose to call our enemies our neighbors, and to let them call us neighbors, and to start to act in ways that, instead of causing harm, might in fact begin to heal each other's wounds.